We left off last time speaking about sex and sexual energy or creative energy and what it was as an essence or the center of every plane that we existed on, and that center lives in the heart of our physical being even, and it represents our vertical connection right to the soul creative source. We're doing this as we are looking at what is called the temptation and fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden. And we're trying to get at understanding the story of good and evil, at least told by the Bible. We'll go on to other stories after a while, but it's still going to be a while yet. And we're talking about the moment of the temptation as a moment, the beginning of the whole moment of our passing into the deepest state of matter, which is opaque, in which we can become blind by seeing only the external surfaces of things. And so we're going to start out talking about temptation. Temptation as a general phenomenon. In our times, being as extroverted as we are, and in our materialism, we tend to say that chocolate is tempting. Or we tend to say that person in all their beauty is tempting. And when you think about it, it's almost like saying that the temptation is outside of us, and it is in the object of our desire. So the times that we live in are extremely extroverted and extremely materialistic. And if you think about it, that's a really curious notion, almost an absurd notion, to think that something, some object outside of us can be tempting to us. The fallacy of it becomes immediately very clear when we see that the object is not a temptation to everyone. I'm sure that a woman that I would find tempting wouldn't at all seem tempting to Bonnie. If you see what I mean, the fallacy is opened up right away. What I'm trying to get at is that in our extroverted materialism, we are so outward that we do not differentiate our desires and the objects of our desires. Now, this was not the case in Lemuria, which is the time of the Garden of Eden. Remember, we're telling a story to explain another story, because most of us are not trained seers. We can't see it all for ourselves, but we're trying to give the descriptions as given by seers of the mystery schools so that we can understand them and see whether they make sense in such a way that we can use them in our life until we can see and test it all out for ourselves. At the time of Lemuria, our consciousness was almost exclusively inward. The object, or I would say the placing of attention of our consciousness, was almost exclusively inward. This doesn't mean that at that time that we didn't have outward experience. It merely means that our consciousness was associated with the inward effects of that experience, and to some extent with the inward origins of even our outer experience, such that if something outward affected us, such like an animal attacked us or something like that, we didn't see the animal outwardly. we saw the animal as an inward thing within ourselves, and we knew its nature from our own inner nature. So temptation, at least as it was in Lemuria, and I tend to think it still is that way, was an inward experience. It's that the temptation is not in the chocolate, but the temptation is in my desire. But it's even a little more subtle than that. I have something like a definition. Temptation seems to be a self-centered, self-oriented, anticipatory stage of desire and its gratification. That is, we encounter an object and we identify ourselves in relation to that object in anticipating the gratification of a desire of that object. And that anticipation of a gratification of ourselves through the interaction with the object of our desire is what we would call temptation. It's a fairly simple definition. It seems to go pretty far. It seems to even go as far as our relationship to temptation, in that we go into it repeatedly because it gives us security. We know ourselves in the interactions, and we have a sense of continuity, not exactly a sense of eternity, but a sense of continuity by repeatedly anticipating and gratifying desires. We know that we are because we desire something and we anticipate that something. It's like knowing the future. Of course, it's very rigged, and our insecurity is never really assuaged by this, because desire has no end. Just like the eternity that we really seek, the self that we really seek that is eternal, that has no end either, but it's a much different kind of thing. That has, because of its very nature, it is eternal. Now, all right, so that's what I mean by temptation as an anticipatory stage of desire. So let's look a little bit at desire as desire is seen by the mysteries. The purpose of desire is to motivate. To motivate us towards something or to motivate us away from something. So desire is for the purpose of motivating change. If we were to be completely mental creatures, we would be creatures that would be in thought, and we would remain in constant truth or thought all the time, and there would be not change. If we were completely etheric people, we would be like plants in that we would be perfectly content to grow and experience life and light from the sun, and we would be happy to stay planted like a plant. But it is the quality of desire that gets us to change. The trained seers that are the teachers of the mysteries claim that within desire there are two basic forces: interest and indifference. So that if there's indifference, there is no motivation. And that one can in fact cultivate indifference. It's a very dangerous thing to do, because if you do, you become indifferent to everything. And if you become indifferent to everything, you have no experience. And if you have no experience, you have no soul of experience, and you have no waking spiritual consciousness. You can be, yes?
With indifference, do you mean being indifferent while still having the desire, or indifferent?
No, you don't even have the desire. You don't even have the desire. You encounter something and you manifest indifference to it. Desire can be registered either relative to the object, which is the way psychologists like Jung do it, or the whole system can be reversed and it can be on the basis of the subject. In fact, you could have a whole typology, almost a mirror image typology of Carl Jung's, based completely on the spiritual subject rather than on the material external object. And it would be every bit as valid, and in some ways more valid, because it would carry deeper into the spiritual worlds. But that's a subject I don't want to get into, because it would be way far away from what we're trying to do. So if a person practiced universal indifference, you could sit indifferently and meditate for eons, but you wouldn't have any spiritual growth. You wouldn't have any spiritual awakening, because you wouldn't have anything really to wake up. You'd have the spirit as it was when you began to practice indifference, but the spirit itself would not be growing. And so it's interest is important. Now, when there are interests, there are different ways that one can react to an object of interest. And one can be attracted to the object of interest, or one can be repelled by the object of interest. In either case, there is a motivation, and in either case, there is a change. Whether you're fleeing for your life, or you're attracted to water because you're thirsty and it's beneficial to your life. So usually it has to do, the attraction and repulsion, not always, but usually it has to do with something being harmonious or adharmonious to our nature, or beneficial or detrimental to us. That is to say, we are attracted or repelled to an object according to whether it is benign or malignant, whether it is good for us or bad for us. For the most part, this is a learned process. That is, we learn to develop a sympathy and antipathy for given objects according to a history, according to memory. That we have various experiences and we remember them repeatedly, and we develop a sympathy. Every time I've drunk water, I have felt better. And over a long period of time, that sympathy, the memory, gets inculcated right into our desire nature. It doesn't have to be that way. If one becomes really proficient in desire or feeling or emotion, one should be able to perceive a desire and understand it relative to one's own nature, and in the same way that a painter can relate one color to another and see whether they're harmonious to a given end or not, one should be able to tell right from the intrinsic nature of self and of the desire, whether it is harmonious or how it is harmonious. But in general, it's a matter of history, remembrance. Most people, we as human beings, are very infantile in the understanding of emotions, feelings, and desires. And so, except for very few emotional painters, that isn't the case. Most of us need to have the soul, the emotional soul, to play upon before we can begin to do something like that. In our desire natures is where we then experience joy and sorrow, pleasantness and unpleasantness, and even pain and pleasure. Now, this is a really interesting thing that the mysteries teachers claim. They claim that even though we injure our body and nerves are affected in that the nerves, through the nervous fluid, carry the experience through the ethers and into the desire body. And that we really feel the pain in the desire body and not in the physical. Because the desire body is for experiencing feeling, even emotions attached to feelings. So that's what the claim is. And the claim is that in our desire natures we can experience joy and sorrow, and pleasantness and unpleasantness, and even pain and pleasure without a somatic experience. And we have cases of that. One of the most famous is sympathetic labor pains, where a husband loves his wife very much, and as she is experiencing labor pains, he experiences them. And if one is sensitive enough, one can associate one's consciousness with almost any creature that is suffering, and even though nothing has happened to the physical body, one experiences the pain. This is very common in things like stigmata, where people feel the unction of Christ Jesus being crucified, and feel the unction of all the pain of the world felt at that time, and that this becomes a driving force in their prayers to greatly accelerate their inward spiritual life. It's not surprising at all. So it is, the desire body is where we in fact experience pain and pleasure and joy and sorrow and all of the other feelings that are attached. It's possible, if we really become adept at desire, that we can have a whole world of desire world experiences, astral experiences, if you want to use that name, that has nothing to do with the physical at all. It's a completely different world. So, we, through artistic experiences, feel some things that are indirect. But for the most part, we feel the feelings directly. We feel them by having actions. In Lemuria, we were being brought to experience desire and pleasure and pain, and the consequences thereof. We were being brought to that end. We were being led to them, to that end, by the gods, by the various spiritual hierarchies that were leading us. And as we said last time, toward the end, when we were leaving off, the gods realized that in order for us to come into our own, we had to begin to learn to experience for ourselves. And they began withdrawing. They previously brought us into the experiences we needed, very much the way animals are brought into them now. They were true experiences, they were vital experiences, and we were brought through the experiences even though we didn't have all of the outward sensations. we still experienced in the desire world. It's, it was like that. Sometimes the rabbit gets away, sometimes the fox gets the rabbit. They were real and vital experiences, and they were designed for us to get the maximum of experience out of them. So when the gods began withdrawing, they were sort of in a dilemma. They realized that instinct was not enough. Instinct is not the same thing as the tutelary effect of a group spirit, of an animal. There are two effects that we have working in us. One is direct guidance by a group spirit that shares its consciousness with an entire species or with a group of members of that species. And its intelligence causes them all to experience the same thing. Sort of that one fish experiences something and every fish in the whole school experiences it. You can see the effect of that, of group spirits, most commonly in schools, like in schools of fishes or in schools of birds. Recently, on several occasions out in the desert, I startled some crested quail, and they all flew off, and just like schools of birds, you can watch it again and again and again. Birds can be busy pecking at seeds, a whole flock of them. And you come up and you startle them, and they all fly off together, and they all fly off in the same direction, but no one bird ever bumps into another bird. And the same thing happens if you can sit there for a half a day. There are still a few crystalline lakes that you can do it with, that you can sit there on a pier and you can watch a school of fish all hovering. Then you drop a stone in the water, and those fish they'll just disappear, but they'll never run into each other. That's because they have a common intelligence. Instinct, on the other hand, is the result of reflective projection. As we have said, each of our vehicles, the physical vehicle, the etheric vehicle, the desire body, even the concrete mind, is a reflective projection of part of our divine spiritual nature. And the wisdom of that spiritual nature extending itself to become even more spiritual is asleep in the body that is a crystallization of its creative activity. So that our bodies, even take for our physical, for example, the stability of our physical bodies and the seemingly changelessness of them, their mineral state, is a reflection of the divine spirit, which is the unchangeable will. But it's not only a vehicle for concrete experience. Somewhere within the physical body is something of the divine spirit that is still yet coming to be. There's something very hypothetical about each of our bodies, and that is sort of a semi-conscious sleeping spirit in the state of becoming, and that is what we call instinct. It seems to work almost automatically, and it seems to have a wisdom that it's all its own, and that it is rather, you might say, cold in its nature. So, the instinct was not enough waked up, and the spirit, the true spirit, could not suddenly draw into the fourfold body. Primarily because there wasn't enough soul for it to play on to intuitively guide the body. So something makeshift had to be done. It is from experiences that we self-consciously absorb and reflect on and assimilate to our spiritual nature that we build soul. And since we weren't self-conscious, or not very self-conscious, we couldn't do much of that. That's what our whole spiritual lives are like, especially if we practice the remembering of all of our experiences with full feeling. We gain a lot of momentum, because the more soul that we get out of our experiences day by day, the more we can come into our physical, and the more we can give to life, and the more rich experiences, or the more awake we can be to experiences. And so our spiritual life is like a very growing thing. And at the beginning in Lemuria, when we were just beginning to be self-conscious, that wasn't possible to us. So we have to realize, well, we're talking about something tens of thousands of years ago, and if we think about how minuscule our waking self-consciousness is now, it gets us to realize that what we are participating in is something enormously immense, something that is slow and tedious, but the perfection that will come out of it, where each and every little experience that we have is registering some effect, and it is to some kind of greater glory in our consciousness. You know, it happens to us once in a while. We understand a little tiny experience, or we see just one smile on somebody's face, and from that we understand volumes of things. But if you think about all of what we're experiencing on a regular basis, it's enormous what's happening. Yes?
Like you were talking about desire having to do with the anticipations. Well, what I was wondering is, like you're talking now about experiences. Well, what about when you're anticipating something you have not yet experienced?
That's something you can't, that really isn't a temptation. That's more like an intuitive anticipation, that you know that there's a truth out there, but you don't have the temptation. It isn't necessarily or exclusively focused in the desire nature. Temptation seems to be something that is self-centered and egocentric, and seems to be associated with desire and its gratification as a means of satisfying the insecurity in that self-centeredness.
And like you were saying before about repeating and feeling security and the repetition, made me wonder, what if it's something you haven't done yet?
If it's something you haven't, there are always new things.
Yeah.
Sometimes it turns out that our desires close us off from new things because it doesn't want to lose the object of its insecurity. And
so you could have the desire, but if you haven't already experienced it, you wouldn't call it temptation?
That's right.
Oh.
Yeah. Or if there wasn't the implication of gratification. Like we may distantly know, because what you're getting at the subtleties of what we're dealing with. Even though we hadn't experienced what we were tempted to in this Garden of Eden story, we had experienced gratification. But I want to continue on with a little bit more subtlety, and it was the promise of gratification that was the temptation, and not just merely the desire itself. Yes?
This whole spectrum or the motivational purpose of desire, between sympathy and antipathy, that can also be avoided, restricted. Like curiosity. It's sort of this either or.
Yeah. That's primarily for the times that we are in right now. Yeah, that's primarily right now, since we are such divided beings that we have these polarities. As we become more unified beings, we will eventually be attracted to all kinds of things, and there will be attraction and sympathy for everything. And in fact, we won't be desiring things for ourselves, and the desires will eventually be turned around, and we will be giving rather than receiving. Right now, we desire things for us, but eventually, yeah, exactly. Well, that's what motivates most people. even the desire for, yeah, yes, yes, yes. Even for some people, salvation, as it is painted as a joyous personal experience, is a selfish notion. I don't want to get on this because it's off of the topic, and I don't want to get too far off of the topic. It's something that we will be coming to eventually, but I'm terribly, terribly slow. What?
Who didn't play the stock?
No. Exactly. All right. So, according to the trained seers, and by trained seers, we're not talking about somebody who is a mere empath, who gets images of someone else according to fear or according to sympathy, but we're talking about someone who can voluntarily look out and see with the inner eyes in the same way that we can look out and see with the physical eyes. But even with our physical eyes, we are not all trained seers. For example, if we go out for a walk and we take an artist, or if we even try to draw something ourselves, we see that previously we didn't see. It's a wonderful thing to try and draw something because you say, now I have really eaten up the world. I've consumed it because I never knew that I was seeing until I could draw it to prove that I had really seen it. There is in the process of perception a lot of self-assuming egoism, so that just because we see what's out there, we think we know it. And training, like artistic training, if we took a scientist along, like we took a botanist along, the botanist could tell us something about the nature of the plants, whether they were healthy or unhealthy, or why they had a particular green that they had. A geologist could tell us something much more. These are trained observers. They have schooled themselves so that they can intuitively connect perceptive experiences with truths behind them so that there is a unified truth behind things. The same thing is true with clairvoyance, that a person who becomes a seer doesn't immediately know something. It takes an enormously long time to understand what the meaning is. And there is the same problem with clairvoyance as there is with physical vision, the same kind of egoism. We have to be humbled a great deal because the problem is magnified, because everything feels true when you see with the inner vision. It feels so true that it must be so that you don't realize that you might be just as assuming, or you might be just as likely to illusion, or perhaps even more so than elsewise. But at any rate, trained seers, and it's up to you to decide who you think is a trained seer. I'm not going to say this one is and this one isn't, because to some extent we're all in the dark, and the ones that are testable and the ones that answer to our intuitions are more likely to be good candidates. But at any rate, the seers claim that in Lemuria, the hierarchies, the archangels, and other beings that were working with our desire nature did something very curious. They stratified our desire nature, or partitioned our desire nature, and what they did is they put a pseudo-self in the higher part of the desire nature to function as an automatic self-protective agency as they withdrew, because they had other things to do, and it was getting to be the time that they couldn't directly interfere anymore, because it would be wrong for them to directly interfere. So if we take the old hourglass picture that we've been using all along, and we say we have a threefold spirit projecting through a mind into a three- or fourfold body, it turns out that the human spirit, that is the color or character of the ego, or self with a capital S, gets reflected into the desire nature, where we have the color of feeling, emotion, and desire. In a similar way, the life spirit is reflected into the etheric or vital nature. And as we said earlier, the divine spirit is reflected into physical. And so, in this desire body, it was stratified, and there was the capability of taking the nature of selfhood, which had been awakened in us already, but with the potentiality had been awakened. There was a self, but it wasn't self-conscious yet. They reflected that into the higher part of the desire body, and it became something like a second self. We know it now as the lower nature. And the idea was that until the true self could enter in, when there was more soul material, and when there was more awakening of the stuff that is instinct into spiritual power, until then, this second self, or this pseudo-self, working through the desire nature, would take care of the personality, would look out for it until the spirit was ready. Now, it was to this lower nature, this second self, that the Lucifers introduced themselves. It was to this that they spoke. Because this lower nature, or second self, was more of a reactive agency. It wasn't really a true self. It was empty. Its reality depended completely upon the divine nature. It reflected that which was divine. And they thought if they could get this to reactively motivate the personality in ways that were helpful to it, that they could have their way with us. Now, we must not conclude that this lower self was as polluted and selfish as it has become over many millennia. We didn't have any baser natures. We weren't base at the time of Lemuria. We were animal-like humans. We were still humans, but we were animal-like humans in that we were recapitulating the desire state. But we're just like the animals now. The animals are not base. In some cases, we can pervert them. We can pervert, for example, something like a Rottweiler or a pit bull. We can pervert it into being a very vicious thing. And if we allow an animal to be overcome by an entity, even a human entity, but any kind of desire entity, we can have something like a rabid lion or something like that, a man-eating lion. But for the most part, we and even the lower self were innocent. We were something, I hate to say it, but we were like the dodos on the Galapagos when the first Western explorers arrived. You could walk right up to them and grab them by the neck. They didn't know. It was that kind of innocence. But despite being innocent, we were beginning to experience ignorance and everything that goes along with ignorance, including insecurity. We were beginning to focus our attention, as was intended, deeper and deeper into the material world, even to the opaque material world, because that was what was forming now. And simultaneously with that, the more we became involved or focused our consciousness into the material world, the more we lost the sight of the spiritual worlds, the inner worlds. we weren't intended to lose it all altogether, but in effect, we were becoming more aware of something we didn't know. Because especially the solids, in the whole of the entire creative, evolutionary creation that we belong to, there had never been solids before. There had never been opaques before. And so we were entering into something that we were ignorant of. And we were, to some extent, losing consciousness of the place where security comes from, the spiritual light. We were, so to speak, further and further away from God. There was a psycho-spiritual distance. At the same time, the divinities who had guided us from without, even though it seemed like within us, were guiding us directly, were withdrawing. And so we were left on our own, or more or less on our own. So we were getting further and further away from the knower of the truth and from the deputies of the knower of the truth. We were becoming earthbound, or at least earth-focused. So obviously there was uncertainty, there was ignorance, and there was insecurity. To be without the source, or to be less in touch with the source. You know how it is. It doesn't always end up tragically, but sometimes you love people and they love you, and then for some reason or another, they withdraw their attention. And when they withdraw their attention, it's terrible to go through when you have loved someone loving you and their love is not coming anymore. It's a really painful thing to go through. And that's the way it was with humans. So we had this pseudo-selfhood to rely on. It wasn't cunning. It was just a more stopgap kind of thing. In this position, being so innocent and at the same time insecure, we were easy pickings for the Lucifers, just like the dodos were easy pickings. The gods, because gods are gods, they couldn't interfere. And like all creators, they had to trust in the basic divinity in us, and they had to trust in their creative work. They had to trust that their love was going to have its final outcome in us. At this point, the results are still not in yet. It's uncertain who has won the election. And so that's what we're talking about, especially since it's a... Yes. Yes. You're in the middle of something that's been going on for a whole year, and yeah. I mean, these talks we've had several previous talks where we have introduced the Lucifers. Yes. Primarily from using Western names, because I don't know all of the Eastern names and the Egyptian names and the Babylonian names and all of those things, because I guess I balk at learning all of that, because I don't want to be some kind of... What? I refuse to make comment.
Would you like to have a space at the end of the class so we can ask questions? I don't feel like disturbing the class.
Okay. All right. Sure. People will have to note their questions then, but that's all right. I'll go either way. All right. Now we have said that temptation is in us, that is in the subject, and it's not outside in the object. So the Lucifers had to work within us because we didn't know the without. That was what we were ignorant of. And neither did the Lucifers, for that matter. They knew it was there, and they knew some of the principles of creation so that they could throw a monkey wrench into it, but they didn't know of the material world any more than we did. And so they had to work inside of us, using the old statement that Rudolf Steiner used relative to materialism. To slay the dragon, you must get under its scales. And the Lucifers got under our scales, so to speak. The Lucifers worked into our desire natures. But when they did so, they did it semi-indirectly. I don't know how to say this. They used a mechanism that was something like sympathetic vibration, only a little bit more direct. And they did not, for example, possess us. Possession means they would have taken control of our vehicles and entered into our bodies, which they were smart enough to know not to do. The Lucifers didn't want to be imprisoned or exiled in the material world any more than we do when we once realize there's something more beyond it. They wanted freedom. So what they did is something that is called overshadowing. It is possible to insinuate or to integrate your consciousness into the consciousness of someone else so that they feel it and they respond accordingly. It is not the same thing, for example, as suggestion. In the case of suggestion, someone impacts thoughts onto your etheric body just as you impact thoughts onto your etheric body, and you respond immediately, just like a hypnotic suggestion. They didn't do that. They wanted a little bit more freedom for them and for us. But you know how it is when you're around some people, you feel uneasy around them, or other people you feel really mellow because they got a nice vibe around them. If a person intentionally overshadows your consciousness, they can make themselves known to you. It's not considered an ethical procedure. Not the fact that there have been some great so-called occult writers that have written many volumes on the basis of having been overshadowed. It's not considered an ethical thing because it does not allow the person to pick up things for themselves, to reach out with their own emotional nature, their own mind, their own etheric nature. It's an overshadowment of that type. Persuasion is one thing, but because somebody is emotionally stronger and can put you into a funk or can put you into a reverie, doesn't mean they have the right to do that. It is a great testament to the divine that the divine is as subtle as it is in making its wishes known to us, so that there isn't that kind of overpowering that goes on. So at any rate, they overshadowed. And they insinuated themselves especially into us when we were reborn as females. Every time we were reborn as females and listened to the Lucifers, they chose us to work on. The reason for this there are several reasons, is that when the bodies were gendered, to allow for simultaneous experience in the external world through procreation, which is necessary when you have a solid physical world. You have to have the polarization into discrete, separate bodies, but at the same time you have to have the ability for progress. So the sexes were divided so that each could contribute half of the energy to physical ongoing manifestation and half of the energy, or some, I hate to say half, that's awfully mathematical. So that some of the energy could be put into procreation and some of the energy could be put into evolutionary advancement. When this was done, the female body was meant for internal creative activity, whereas the male body was meant for external projective material activity. Females, or somebody incarnated in a female body, has to make babies. And that is taking a creative energy, taking an archetype, taking, knowing the whole intent, it happens unconsciously with most people, taking that energy and turning it inward and building a new form. So this internal kind of consciousness made those of us, when we were in female bodies, more subject to the Lucifers. This is why it was Eve that was tempted. Moreover, the etheric body of the female is positively charged, and so when there was the overshadowing, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there have those things where you can make a strong electric field that when you put a light bulb in it, the light bulb lights up. You can't see the electric field, but you can see the light bulb light up. And a similar thing happens with an overshadowing. That is, one can see an inner light, and there is something more of to light up, or there was at that time in the female body. Last time we talked about the sexual energy, even on the physical, being a concentration of the creative energies of all levels that we exist on. And we said that it played along the spine, that it was the nuclear, creative, controlling, the more divine part of our being. In human beings, this is divided. Part of it is used for physical creation, and it's located near the base of the spine. And part of it is associated with spiritual creation, with the forming and carrying out of ideas and expressing them in words. And this split nucleus is connected by the spine, so that we have the Adam's apple and brain, which looks like a spiritual flower of firelight to the clairvoyant vision. And then we have the flower at the other end, which is like a womb that is the source where the a physical, sensational energy is worked out. And in between them, there is an undulation of light rising and falling, and it follows a wave-like pattern that is basically, like the caduceus of Mercury, serpentine. Even though it's alive and wave-like, it's probably the best way to understand it is like a standing wave inside of a flute, that there are definite places where the crossovers of the undulations or waves take place, and at those crossover points, the involutionary and evolutionary creative energies in us meet, and they are capable of receptive and projective activities in and of their own on various levels of development, but I don't want to go into that because that would again be a huge, big side trip. So, when the Lucifers entered us, they focused their attention not only within our auras, but within the heart of our auras, that is in the undulatory energy of the spine. And this is why our little story says it was a serpent. It looked like a snake that did the tempting. So that's where the snake comes into the story. Now, if we were so much more, even though we were losing it, even if we were so much more spiritually aware in Lemurian times, and that we recognized what the little Bible story tells us, the booming presence of Jehovah, how could the Lucifers have been as effective as they were? Because relative to the divine power, they were minuscule. And our awareness was greater. But it's something like how close you are. I don't know how to say it. Suppose you're several billion miles out in space, and you're in a little module, and you have a flashlight with you. That flashlight is more valuable to you than the sun, even though the sun is much more powerful, much more central. It's how close you are. And the Lucifers recognized our great insecurity in being more and more removed. And they represented a close presence. Moreover, they communicated to us in a way or in a part of our psychological being that, that was designed to be reactive or responsive. So if something's coming at you, bam, you disappear, you go off. And if they appeal to, if something, a close light, said to you, this is good for you, you'd respond to it. And this is the way it works. So I'm trying to get at something here that is extremely subtle. Extremely subtle, because it's something that we're going to come back to again and again. I'm trying to say that the technique that was used by the Lucifers was very clever. But we can't say the devil made me do it. We cannot say that. We still have responsibility. We can describe the circumstances, but we must also describe our responsibility at the same time. It was, after all, in freedom that we made our decision. It wasn't completely an automaton kind of response that we made. So they directed their attention to us. They communicated to us that we're reborn primarily in the female bodies, and they worked on our nuclear creative existence. Now, at this point, we've got to take an aside because we could have some really, really mistaken notions here. We know that this is a very nascent humanity. We were human beings in that we were threefold spirits capable of self-knowledge. And we had fourfold personalities. We had a physical nature, we had an etheric nature, we had an emotional nature, and we had the ability to think. So we were complete human beings. But we were whole human beings, but not complete, would be a better way of saying it. We hadn't brought out the full potential of any of our vehicles or faculties. So, we were in a state of development, and we're going to be in a state of development for a very, very long time. We were less self-conscious. We've said we were very, very inward. And we were less aware of others outside of us. Now, we have all of these lovely artistic conceptions of Adam and Eve that Penny has brought in, and they're all beautiful, but they're not anything like physical reality. They're not at all like the physical reality. According to trained seers that have checked and cross-checked and corroborated each other, the physical bodies were quite a great deal different. We have a whole bunch of illusions that we have to straighten out. In the first place, the whole earth itself was condensing out of the ethers and organizing in this period. So it was an emotional, or I should say it was a fireball, an energetic fireball that was becoming solids, liquids, and gases. This means then that in Lemurian times that we condensed out of energy at the same time that the earth condensed out of energy. Now this is a really, really big thing. The ramifications of this in terms of science are really quite something. In the first place, it says that our mineral-like recapitulation and our animal-like recapitulation took place completely within energy states. And that anything that we have prior to the human state, or even prior to the recapitulation of us as plant-like or animal-like, had to have taken place in the energy, and that any remnants of that are condensed out of energy. You see what I'm trying to say? That if we find fossilized plant forms that are antecedent to animal forms, that those forms didn't necessarily exist in this stuff, but that they existed in the energy, and that when the energy crystallized, that the forms crystallized right within the energy. Now, that sounds far-fetched, but it happens all the time. This has been a great winter for it. You can almost see what the weather is going to be like, or you can almost see what the astrology is like for unusualness. Just look at the mud puddles. When they freeze, the lines of energy freeze in the crystalline patterns, and this year they've been very dramatic lines of force that are frozen, crystallized right into the frozen water puddles. And so what spiritual science says, it says that many of the things that we call fossilized, discarded forms did not necessarily form in the stuff that they are in now as it is now. So that the view of evolution as seen by science has to be greatly, greatly modified. But it's not really that hard to believe, but it's going to take this has been a constant thing. You can go back for over a century now, when Madame Blavatsky was writing and making claims that seers of the mystery schools had made, and she was laughed at by the science, and slowly but surely these claims that are made by spiritual scientists are gradually being accepted by material scientists. They put them in different words. Consciousness change doesn't make any difference. So this means then that when we were mineral-like humans, plant-like humans, and to some extent even animal-like humans, the earth was not yet made up of solids, liquids, and gases. That happened in the same period that we're talking about. some of the animal stages had already gone through in the energy state, and in the period that we're talking about when the continents were solidifying and we were living on the dense solidified continents, the forms are described as being much smaller and almost dog-like in shape. So Adam and Eve are not at all anything that look like this, and the makeup of the stuff was not anything like it is now. My guess is it is probably like the tarsars or lemurs that you find in Madagascar. I don't want to go into a big long diversion, but the area between Madagascar and Sri Lanka and Australia, that part of the Indian Ocean in there probably is where the first continents consolidated, and then after the surface of the earth remelted and then recondensed again, and the present the descriptions of the formations of continents as given by spiritual scientists is fairly similar to the modern notions that they're having now. If you read, I think about 2 months ago in Discover magazine, they showed how the continents began showing up in different places and such like that. It's not too far off. All right. So some people even say, the eyes, we couldn't see with eyes as we see now because the water was still vaporous yet. Our atmosphere was more like Venus than it is now because the earth was very hot and there wasn't enough light for the eyes to have evolved the sensitivity that they have now. In fact, some people even claim that the pineal gland and part of a strand stuck out of the head and that it was a heat sensor, and that we kept ourselves from being burned to pieces by sensing heat from lava flows, so that our bodies just didn't burn up. I don't know if that's why we have a cold sensor. If we eat ice cream too fast or hold it against the roof of our mouth, you get those terrible headaches. I don't know if that's the same thing. You know anything about that? All right. Thought I might get an answer there. I don't know anything about the primordial soup, but at any rate, those beings had a dim human-like consciousness, and it was to that consciousness that the Lucifer spirits addressed themselves. And somewhat the gist of what they made known to us, though they didn't talk to us like we're, not so awkward as using words as we're using now, but more like impressionism, very powerful, because musical impressionism can move a person from mood to mood to mood and can bring you to a very specific state of consciousness. They said something to the effect of, we know you're beginning to lose the divine light. We can help you to find light, and it will be a light of knowledge. Unfortunately, it was a light like their own light. It wasn't the origin. It wasn't the spiritual creative light. And it was the false light that is spoken of in many mythologies. The beings or bringers of false light, to whom the Bible refers as brought by people who were thieves and robbers. They further went on to make us aware of saying, we know you are becoming aware of your outer bodies and of an outer world that you do not know. You are now depending more on them for your consciousness. We can teach you how to perpetuate those bodies and how to create new bodies at will. And in that regard, you'll be like the gods. We know you are losing the love and the joy of inner light. We can teach you to have a knowledge of pleasure and of pleasure at will. And you will be like the gods. So you can see this is like a temptation. You are entering a realm of which you are ignorant and insecure. we will teach you to know that world through your body. You have been told if you eat of the fruit on which we twine, of the tree on which we twine, you will learn death. We claim you will learn good and evil, and all you have to do is follow our instructions, and we will teach you immortality. We will teach you the difference between good and evil. This basically was the gist of their argument. Now, the curious thing about it is, if you think about that, even as in the brief rendition of the 3rd chapter of Genesis, the Lucifers did not lie. The Lucifers said nothing that was untrue. However, the more we go along in spiritual things, the more we realize that the unspoken is at least as meaningful as the spoken. The unseen, the unmanifest, has at least as much reality as the visible and the manifest. And in the same way that there can be a profound silence, there can be a sinister silence. There can be an omission, so that there can be a saying of the truth, but omitting certain things in such a way that if you follow what is said and are not aware of the omissions, that you can get yourself in deep trouble. So what we're saying is that in the same moment that we learned good and evil, we learned the flavors of good and the flavors of evil. We learned both the sin of commission, which is what it means to follow the instructions or the temptation of Lucifer, and we learned the sin of omission, sometimes called the satanic or the Aramanic sin of not doing something, or of keeping something in secret. So this moment was, see, I don't know how to say it in the other way. Self-consciousness is the same thing that, remember in the very beginning of things, the One, when it knew the One, knew that there was something that it was not. When we come to self-consciousness, waking self-consciousness as human beings, we learn the same thing. We learn exactly what we are and what we're capable of, but we also learn what we are not. However, the bringing of us to that self-consciousness in the manner that we were brought to it is the recognition of what we are and what we aren't. In both cases is polluted, or in both cases it is perverted. And this is the mischief of the Lucifers. Now I want to take a little sidelong divertimento, because we've been saying some pretty outrageous things here. And we've been saying that they're all on the basis of seers. Seers, many of us don't know who all these seers are, because they have the way of keeping themselves rather anonymous to hide from vanity, but I'm sure some people would say it's sinister, something like that. But our little story in the Bible is very different from what we're talking about here. But our little story in the Bible was abbreviated, and it was written for people thousands and thousands and thousands of years later, and it was just meant to give them a focus so that they could tune in on the cosmic facts. Materialism, by the time the Bible was written, was already fact. Now, if we want to look for scriptural evidence, there is scriptural evidence for everything we're saying. It just so happens that not all of the scriptural evidence was accepted until fairly recently. You know, there are those people, what you are is what you project. And there are scriptures that state this quite openly. But because it is so open, those who are more subject to the satanic or the Ahrimanic or the omission kind of consciousness say, that must be evil because it's too open and direct. If you say the truth like it really is, there must be something evil about it. You know what I'm trying to say? And there's a way that you can appeal to people like that. And so it didn't work its way always into Orthodox literature. Now, because people like Max Heindel and Rudolf Steiner and people like that have written the seer's point of view, I want to give you some vindication from modern Bible scholarship to show that these things really are recorded scripturally. And I'm just going to give you a really quick, short little list of quotes if you want to look them up. The first is from the apocryphal book called the Book of Adam and Eve. And it says, literally, the tempter is not ugly, but a beautiful and glorious being of radiance. That is, of light. And even a false light, sort of flashlight is a false light, can be beautiful. Yeah, I like looking at the Christmas lights. Another, from the Testament of Dan. It says, open and outright, this is one that raises people's hackles when they hear this. The tempter appears in the spine, especially during copulation. Meaning to say that light and vision is afforded to people at that time, not afforded at other times. This was carried literally right into the Middle Ages. Witches were said to communicate with the devils by having men join with them in copulation, and then the devils would speak through the men's spines, and they would light up, and they would understand what they were supposed to do. It's quite interesting. There's another book called the Book of Moses, and it says outright that Lucifer was hurled to earth. But it is not meant that this is a curse. In fact, it's possible to interpret that passage out of the Book of Moses as saying, well, water didn't tame Lucifer, maybe earth is heavy enough to do it. It's that kind of an outlook. The Book of Moses also said that the serpent tempter was in the spine. The Book of Moses also relates that lust or sin, that is the consequence of lust, is the root of all sin is lust, basically. And it goes further to say in another place is the worship of humans, that is egoism, not mere personal physical egotism, but the worship of humans is the worst of all evil. We're going to have a lot to say about that. Another book called The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs says fornication outside of divine intention is the source of evil. And that means to say that taking the creative energy and using it as it was not intended to be used is the source of evil. It doesn't say only fornication, because it actually can mean magic, as we saw from above. Then there is the apocryphal Greek apocalypse of Baruch. And it says, wine and lust are the two agencies of closing us off from the kingdom of heaven. Meaning to say that the effect of alcohol and the effect of repeated sexuality close us off from the spiritual world. And the whole story, as we have told it, is pretty much found also in the Coptic Gospels. All right. What? I don't know that they address this. I'm not really familiar with a lot of what they deal with. All right. Obviously, what the Lucifers did not say, relative to what they did say and following what they said, it became clear what the intent was. What the actions were is what resulted. And that's what we're going to be talking about, especially next time. They did not say that the knowledge that they brought to us was primarily carnal knowledge. And carnal knowledge exclusive of divine knowledge. It is not a bad thing that we know of our physical existence in the material world. It is not a bad thing that we consciously practice the use of sexual interaction. But to have lost the intent and to act out of harmony from the intent of the creative energy is where the evil comes in. The Lemurians were sort of the opposite of us. They were almost exclusively aware in the inner world and almost unaware in the outer worlds. When they began what you would say indiscriminately practicing sexuality, that is outside of a honeymoon. The honeymoon comes from the term of the angels working from the moon to control the procreative activity so that it was practiced harmoniously with natural law, with various astrological timings and things like that. When we began doing it that way, that is where all of the problem came in. We learned more of pleasure, and we gratified ourselves with pleasure. Not to say that the things in the material world aren't meant to be pleasurable. They can be. It's just a matter of the difference of intent. So great, the opposite is, like carnal knowledge. In the 4th chapter of Genesis, it says Adam knew Eve and she bore Cain. The knowing is the kind of knowledge. It's the first place that the word knowing is used, is after the temptation and fall. We were so inward that the only time we knew of someone outside of us, and to some extent that we even knew of our physical bodies, was in the act of copulation. That in the intense sensation, in the intense sensitivity of that experience, we knew there was somebody out there. It's curious now when we're coming out of matter and we think that we're very separate people, and we hear it all the time. The more neurotically separate we are, we say, you can't know what it's like in my world. You know what I'm saying? That we think that we're so separate, and we vainly say that no other universe can be like what our universe is. Sometimes the only time that we know that there is somebody in there is in sexuality. It's the only time we know that somebody has a feeling. And for some people who do not unite in prayer or in the ecstasy of some other kind of spiritual practice, for some people, the only experience of a kind of unity comes in sexuality. So that I'm not trying to knock everything here. I'm just trying to say that, just give you a picture of what it is all about. So this is the kind of knowledge, carnal knowledge, that was brought to us by the Lucifers. But it was bought at the expense not only of selfish pleasure, but of pain. All of our sense organs are sense organs of pain. the nerves are pained in everything. If we see a smile or we see a lovely landscape or we get a gentle caress, it's because of something that comes along with it. It's not because of the caress or the sunset that we see the beauty of it. You see what I'm trying to say? That we have, we see something more than just the experience. It is by very sensitively adapting to light, which was painful to nerves, that we developed eyes. And the same thing with ears and touch and everything else. They still are to this day painful. And sometimes experiences that are meant to be the most pleasurable are often the most painful because our sensitivity is so high, we recognize that everything in that realm of sensory experience is born in pain. So when the curse is given, the so-called curse says that it is pain, that you're going to learn everything you learn, and you're going to earn your bread, which is not only our physical bread for sustenance, but it is our soul bread whereby we grow. That's born by pain. And it said we would learn by knowledge, and everything that we know now is deadly. Even our sense perception is dead. What we see, by the time we register an image, that image is a stopped image, and it is dead. We can't understand anything except by stopping to analyze it. Some people are starting to get so that they have live intuitions, but for the most part, our knowledge is analytical knowledge, where we take something apart and dies. It dies in the process. Even energy itself, which is live and vital, we only see in its deathly state, in its entropic state. It used to be whole in the ethers, but as it's breaking down and going into entropy is how we measure it. All of physics is the physics of death. And so, when it says that, so when the curse is pronounced, when the rest of the story is told by Jehovah, that we would learn about death, very true, that is the case. It happens that we get very specific knowledge, and we have a very special kind of knowledge. We're going to talk about it from time to time in the next few weeks, by dealing with deathly knowledge, but we only have partial knowledge. Now we know in part. But when that which is perfect is come, or that which is total, or that which is whole, then that which is in part will be done away. So our consciousness now is an extremely limited, deathly, partial carnal knowledge. It has gotten so far that it has literally become a materialistic illusion. It has become a materialistic illusion that we think that the outer world is the only reality there is, and that it is the source of everything else. That if there are spiritual worlds, they're just a result of the interactions of matter, which is materialism in its highest sense. And so we live in a dead and deathly world, and it's gotten so far that from Nietzsche on, people have said even God is dead. And the only way that God can be dead is because we have killed God by focusing intentionally away and have taken our insecurity and gone deeper and deeper and deeper into matter, more and more into separation, more and more into disintegration, and have moved further away from our own inward consciousness, and we have killed God, so to speak, by our own activities. That's as far as we're going to go for tonight. Next time we're going to begin by returning to the philosophy of time, because we want to see exactly what the consequence of this is relative to the universe, and it's a very hard thing to understand, and I'm not sure I'm even going to be able to begin to get it across, but the philosophy of time is helpful to that understanding. You have a question? Yeah, questions? Oh, I don't know that it would be 800,000 years ago. I would think that it would be a much longer time. You've hit on a very difficult subject. Some people keep time as a... Well, no, the timing of this, I believe it is measurable, but it is kept from the profane, because all of the worst experiments that have been done by people to use the forces of nature to their own grandiose adventures have been done by trying to know and control the times. In fact, at one time, part of the destruction of Atlantis was supposedly done when, as a scientific experiment, they tried to control the moon, the speed of the moon, so that they could control the timing of when events of destiny would come about without realizing the greater consequences. And it was one of those things that the wise were captured in their own folly, and it led to a great destruction because they unleashed something they didn't know they were unleashing. So the exact timings, I have some thoughts on the timings of it and why the timings are even kept secret. It's even told that you can't, that the reasons for telling you can't be told, because if they were told to you, that in itself would be revealing more than most people are capable of dealing with. I think it's one of those things, one of the simple things about it is that in our materialism, in the consciousness that we have come to as a consequence of the fall, we tend to look at events rather than the causes of events, rather than the meaning of events. And if we knew that something was going to happen, we would focus more on that thing happening rather than on why it was going to happen and the wherefores of it. And this is one of the things that you find frequently in the recordings of the myths surrounding the oracle at Delphi. Many specific things were told by the oracle, but because people took them literally and only took the events and didn't understand the whys and wherefores of them, they played right into the tragic events because they were looking at them selfishly or small-mindedly in that materialistic event-oriented way rather than, as so to speak, flowing with the time and the spirit that is born in the time. One of the things that you've missed in this presentation is that potential, which is the relationship from the ever unknown absolute to the manifest. The potential is polarized just as the duality of spirit and matter is polarized within being, and that potential is polarized between time and space, and that the matter end of existence is more associated with space, and the time end of potential is more associated with spirit. And to try to bring an understanding of time into a consciousness that is space and matter oriented is a very dangerous thing. It leads to our greater misunderstanding. Okay. Thank you very much.